Our Vice Chairperson, Pauline Tully.
Thank you, Ciara, and good evening, and thank you for your contribution this evening. I suppose you've all identified how important it is to achieve the SD goals and to do it in conjunction with the implementation of the UNCRPD, that they go hand in hand and in tandem. And you've all identified that disabled people are vulnerable. Well, I think what Niall McLaughlin actually said was that disabled people are not inherently vulnerable, but they become vulnerable to their social and environmental barriers. And that's what we hear from disabled people all the time. It's not the disability that actually disables them, it's the environment that they're trying to negotiate at all times. And that obviously has to be worse in a crisis situation, whether it's a war or natural disaster. So I can understand how difficult it is. But I suppose one of the things there, the Article 11 of the UNCRPD, situations of risk and humanitarian emergencies, that was introduced after the tsunami of 2004, which saw the deaths of 230,000, many of them disabled people who were just left behind. However, we go to COVID-19 and the response, and we saw disabled people being left behind. We go to the flooding in Germany in 2021, disabled people were left behind. The Ukrainian war, disabled people are left behind. So things haven't changed. So I'm just wondering what can be done to improve it so that we're not constantly seeing disabled people left behind. I dread to think what the people of Gaza are going through, and especially again the vulnerable people there. And in many other places in the world where there's conflict, there seems to be conflict in a lot of places here. So I do appreciate the work you do. It's very, very important. But we have a UNCRPD because disabled people were left behind and not treated equally, and haven't been for decades and generations. And it's an uphill battle to ensure they are. If disabled people had their rights the same as everybody else, well then they wouldn't have to overcome so many barriers, and they would be a part of society and they wouldn't be forgotten about when a crisis or a humanitarian situation arises. I suppose as well, because such your work, we've got people from two departments here and then another organisation, and your work is all similar. Do you cooperate across departments and organisations? Because we hear people all the time who come in here and they talk about silos, where you have different departments addressing similar issues but not working in tandem with each other. So I'm just wondering, do you work in together? Is there cooperation across departments, or cooperation on how to achieve goals? And I suppose the other thing, that has been raised a few times with us as well, is international election monitoring, and how important it is to ensure that democracy and that elections are fair and so on. I know we as a committee recommended the election observation process in Ireland increase the recruitment of observers with disabilities to a minimum of 15%. I'm just wondering, has that been achieved?
Chairman, thank you. I'll answer the easy question first. Do we work across departments? Well, actually, that has been a challenge on the SDGs. The SDGs do challenge every government system to work in a more integrated manner and to tackle the silos that did exist before. And because all of the goals are dependent, the achievement of the SDGs is only possible if all of the goals are achieved, and they are interdependent. And that's a really important point. There's no good anyone saying we've achieved SDG 3 and 6 and 9. You can't achieve one without achieving them all. So that pushes the administrative system in all governments to cooperate, to work together more effectively. And I would say when we adopted the goals in 2015, and with the very strong role that Ireland played, we then had a period internally in the system of trying to work out how to do that, and it was a challenge, and every country had to do it in a different way. But the Department of the Environment has the overall coordinating lead, and then every government department has to work towards reporting on what we're doing on the SDGs, which have national and international responsibilities. Now, for the Department of Foreign Affairs, our work is broadly on the international side. But I think the coordinating mechanisms, the working together, and the cross-departmental work has improved hugely because of the Sustainable Development Goals, and is much better than it was in the past. And there is a much better understanding of that interdependence. I would say, and it probably took the system a little longer to do it than it took, for instance, young people in schools and universities to understand the SDGs. Because this concept of interdependence that we used to talk about 20, 30 years ago, I think it's much clearer to everybody now just what that means. And one of the biggest impetuses, as it were, to building that understanding has been climate change, which affects absolutely everybody, be they whether they're sitting in Dublin or they're sitting in Lilongwe in Malawi. So I think the cross-government, cross-department cooperation and coordination and engagement is miles better than it was 10 years ago. And I would put that down to the SDGs, but I would also say, obviously, it will always need to improve. I think there's a very important point that you make about working in Article 11 post-tsunami, working in emergencies, and the fact that sometimes it doesn't look like progress is being made because and in fact, the disasters that we're facing sometimes feel to be getting worse and worse and happening with much greater frequency. And the truth is that natural disasters are happening with much greater frequency. And the truth is that conflicts are happening with much greater frequency. And we don't have the luxury of dealing separately with conflicts because they're both interlocking and overlapping. And so we have been, and it is very important in all of that, and you made that point, Deputy, to listen to the voice of people who are living with disability rather than deciding ourselves as administrators or politicians what it is that they need. Now, that is what we attempt to do. But on emergencies, we have started working with the UN on exactly this point. We're working with the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UN OCHA, on just how you can make progress on including and much more effectively disabled people in the response to humanitarian emergencies. And just a year or two ago, we launched the UN Interagency Standing Committee guidelines on the inclusion of persons with disability in humanitarian action. There is a lot of work going on in that, where Irish Aid, Foreign Affairs, is working along with the United Nations, but there is a lot more work to be done. Now, the Central Emergency Response Fund of the UN, to which Ireland is one of the main donors, actually, is the UN system of responding immediately and rapidly to emergencies. And Ireland supported an initiative to tackle underfunded areas that weren't being funded under the Central Emergency Reserve Fund, and one of those included disability. We were on the advisory board of this UN fund, and we actually were able to make progress there, and we are now being reappointed this year, at the end of this year, to that fund, which is a very influential post in advising and working on how the UN responds to emergencies. And we will have an opportunity there to raise the profile for our commitment to disability inclusion in humanitarian action. And having said that here today, when we join it, I hope that you will hold us to account and ask us about how we have managed that when we're back on that advisory group from the end of this year. Election monitoring, yes, I'm aware of that recommendation. As you probably know, the next version of the election roster is underway at the moment. We advertised for expressions of interest, and at the moment these are being assessed with a view to appointing the new roster at the end of this year. And we have included in that disability inclusion. We have consulted on how to do that. I will be honest, I don't know that we will reach the 15% target, but what I can say is that we are making strong efforts to ensure that we do recognise the role that people living with disability can and should play in election monitoring. And I'd be happy to come back to you on that subject when we have the new roster completed in the coming months.
Deputy Tully, I'll respond to something Michael said as well in a minute, but I would talk about cooperation firstly. There is a lot of cooperation among INGOs, sometimes too much. We have too many meetings nearly. But there is a Disability Inclusion Development Working Group here in Ireland that a number of NGOs and ourselves are part of. Nob here as a co-chair. So we discuss, we engage with Irish Aid at those meetings as well. Irish Aid's disability focal person was at the last meeting last week as well. So there's a lot of overlap, engagement, discussion, but also ourselves, we work with other INGOs. Mabba was currently working with Trócaire on a piece of work to bring disability inclusion into Trócaire's work more generally. CBM is what we call an inclusion advisor group that works with the UN at different levels, been brought in to support UNICEF in Nepal on bringing disability inclusion into their work, the World Food Programme on some of their larger pieces of work as well. Pretty much the largest UN agency in terms of the scale of work that it does. So a lot of cooperation and trying to add value and not do everything independently and all by ourselves as well. The tsunami, you talked about the horror of it, and then the same issues arising, when a new rapid onset emergency happens, that people with disabilities do get left behind. Sometimes it's so difficult to prepare for something like that, and if a tsunami is hitting, how do you nearly solve that problem, without asking people to make that decision of fleeing themselves or bringing other people with them? It's such nearly a difficult philosophical decision, never mind an ethical and moral one as well. But there is progress in those areas. We're seeing, like the UN Security Council Resolution 2475, which talks about the protection of people with disabilities in conflict, so creates particular commitments on part of governments and on behalf of actors in the conflict to respect the rights of people with disabilities, not to target them, etc., etc. There's also IASC guidelines on humanitarian response and people with disabilities in that humanitarian response. So they're not ignored, they're part of that response. They're also not just treated or considered as objects to receive benefit from that response, but involved in the discussions around how the humanitarian response in an emergency is shaped, framed, what gets prioritised, how their needs are met as well in humanitarian response. So there's a lot of things happening, and they happen incrementally sometimes, but we're seeing improvements and changes as well. The last thing I would want to say is that it's great for Irish Aid, to have that position on some of the UN boards as well, to be able to influence. But from our perspective as well, we feel that over the last number of years, the percentage of ODA to international NGOs has dropped even though the overall budget is increasing. We would like to see that trend somehow reversed as well, so that percentage is at least maintained and increased as well for the NGO partners. They're the ones that Irish Aid can influence nearly more concretely because they have that direct relationship, whereas you're on a board when it comes to UN pool funding as well. So we definitely appreciate being influenced by Irish Aid if we're being influenced in the right direction as well. But definitely protecting the funding for international NGOs in the overseas aid budget is hugely important as well.